We're told we live in a democracy, right? That our vote matters, that we actually have a say in what happens. But what if that's just a nice story they tell us to keep us quiet? What if the real system operates on a completely different set of rules? Think about that for a second. What if the whole thing isn't broken, but was designed to work exactly like this from the very beginning? A game that was fixed, with winners and losers picked out before anyone even started playing. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. It's about looking at the system's own rulebook.
And here's the bombshell. The hard evidence shows that in so-called Western democracies, the average person has pretty much zero, statistically close to zero, influence on government policy. No, this isn't some wild claim. It is a documented reality based on decades of solid data.
So, if it's not us, who's actually calling the shots? Well, today, we're putting the entire ideology of liberal capitalism on the stand. We're going to act as the jury. We're going to look at the evidence piece by piece and find out how this thing really works.
Okay, let's get into it. Every investigation starts with a motive, right? So what's the core philosophy, the actual operating system that makes this whole machine run? Well, it all kicks off with a really specific and, honestly, a pretty dark view of what people are.
Look, the problems in the system, they aren't some accident. The flaws are a feature, not a bug. At its very core, liberal capitalism sees every single one of us as something called an egoistic agent. That's just a fancy academic term for a simple idea that we are all, fundamentally, selfish creatures, driven only by our own personal gain. That's it.
And hey, don't take my word for it. This is the system's own founding father, Adam Smith, literally explaining how it's supposed to work. He says society functions best not because people are kind or care about their community, but because of pure, cold, calculated self-interest. It is baked right into the DNA of the whole ideology.
So what happens when you build an entire society on that one single idea? You get what scholars call an atomized society. Picture it. Everyone is just an isolated individual, a single atom bouncing around, competing against every other atom. This whole philosophy intentionally breaks down the bonds that tie us together. Community, family, even nation, leaving every single person to fight for themselves. It's the exact opposite of what you might call an ethical life, where our identity is tied to the people in the country around us.
All right, let's move on to the next piece of evidence in our trial. So if the only goal is profit, what happens when the interests of a nation, its people, its culture, its borders? What happens when all that stuff gets in the way of making more money? The answer is brutally simple. The nation has to lose.
From this purely profit-driven point of view, big corporations are actually, by their very nature, anti-nationalist. Think about it. A country's shared culture, its unique traditions, its borders. To a global corporation, these are all just roadblocks, obstacles to maximizing profit. So what's the next logical step for them? They push for globalism, so they can move factories anywhere they want. And they push for mass immigration to drive down the cost of labor right here at home.
And this is not just some theory. The data is absolutely crystal clear. Research from a Harvard economist, George Borges, shows that when you increase the supply of workers in a specific field by just 10%, the wages for everyone in that job go down by at least 3%. Let that sink in. This is a direct transfer of wealth. That money doesn't just vanish, it moves from the paychecks of working people directly into the profit margins of corporations. Okay, now let's go to the actual scene of the crime. To see the real-world wreckage of these policies, all we have to do is look at the United States over the last few decades. The evidence isn't hidden in some dusty book, it's written in the empty factories and shattered communities all across the country. 3.2 million. That is the number of U.S. jobs that were either lost or displaced just between 2001 and 2013, mostly because of the massive trade deficit with China. This wasn't some unavoidable act of nature. It was the direct result of policies that actively encourage companies to ship American manufacturing overseas. And it wasn't just China. Take a look at the impact of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. By 2002, it had already wiped out or displaced almost 900,000 high-wage jobs in the U.S. And these weren't just any jobs. These were the stable, good-paying factory jobs that were the absolute backbone of the American middle class for generations. And this is the key. These trade deals, these policies, they weren't accidents. They were deliberately designed to make it as easy as possible for a company to shut down a factory in Michigan and open up a new one in Mexico or China. The result? Record-breaking corporate profits on one side, and on the other, hollowed-out towns and a completely gutted middle class. So you have to ask yourself, If these policies are so obviously damaging to the average person, how do they keep happening over and over again? Well, that brings us to the final charge in our case: how this small economic elite has managed to completely capture the political system itself. This right here, this is the smoking gun. A huge study by professors from Princeton and Northwestern looked at almost 2,000 different policy decisions over 20 years, and their conclusion: what the average American wants has a near zero statistical impact on public policy, but what the wealthy elite want, that almost always becomes law. It's right there in the data.
So how do they pull it off? One of the main ways is something called the revolving door. It happens so often between Wall Street and Washington, D.C. that some people call the Capitol government sacks. Here's how it works. An executive leaves a huge bank, gets a top job in government writing the rules for their old buddies, and then they cash out by going back to an even bigger, multi-million-dollar job on Wall Street. It's a perfect closed loop of power and influence.
And it gets even deeper than that. As one source put it, corporate lobbyists are basically just part of the government staff now. They're the ones writing the reports, providing the data, and literally drafting the policy recommendations that overworked government staffers then use to write our laws. The corporations are, quite literally, writing their own rules.
You know, maybe the infamous gangster Al Capone said it best. He saw the system for exactly what it was. It's not an illegal crime, it's a legitimate racket. It's a game where the rules are written by the most powerful players to make sure they always win. And it's all done perfectly and completely legally.
So the evidence is clear. The verdict is in. Liberal capitalism creates a system where a tiny wealthy elite can rig the whole game, gut the middle class, and run the government for its own personal benefit. And they do it all while waving the flag of freedom. It is a devastating critique.
But wait. What about the other great ideology that promised to save the worker from this exact system, Marxist communism? Was that the answer we were all looking for, or was it just a different kind of trap? In Part 2, we put communism on trial, and we're going to reveal the terrifying third path that history's most ruthless dictators created to seize power from both of them.